if they come out here and officially, if everyone just agreed that we are all in a recession, and then we all just agreed, which technically, again, by the rule of thumb, we are, does it matter? Hey everyone, welcome to Make Your Money Matter. I'm your host, Brad Barrett. I'm also a managing director and partner here at One Capital Management, and I'm here each week to help you better understand your money because after all, your money matters. And I want to talk about something really important today on the show. Last week, the last week of July, in fact, the GDP numbers, gross domestic production, became more important, I think, than usual for a lot of us. The reason is that GDP, as we saw, declined in the first quarter of this year, 2022, and as of last week, it declined in the second quarter of this year, which means to many that 2 straight quarters of negative growth is the rule of thumb, which we're going to talk about today, around recession. It's the rule of thumb that many of people have used for a long time to label a recession. And I want to share this openly. If you retain anything from today's show, understand this. There's a lot of news going on right now with certain people or our administration trying to politicize, if you will, or use some of these kind of conversations as scapegoats in saying we're not in a recession. And I want to be very clear about something from an economic point of view. That's not completely inaccurate. There's a lot of misinformation going on. So here's what I want to share. Again, from an economic point of view, not a political point of view and not a geopolitical point of view for that matter, but a purely fundamental economic point of view, which by the way, is always our goal because we don't have the luxury of choosing a side here as fiduciary financial advisors. We have to be objective. But before we dive into some recession talk here, make sure to smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single episode. All right, let's get into it. So when as advisors, we are doing our job correctly, again, being a fiduciary advisor to our clients here at One Capital, again, we don't have the luxury of being on either side of the political fence. We have our personal opinions as we all are allowed on this earth, especially in the freedom we have in our country, but we can't bring that into our asset management or our portfolio management or our advising because we have to look at things objectively. And that's why I want to share the objective and unbiased advice and the real numbers that I think we all need to be looking at here. So in our opinion, we think investors are paying probably a little too much attention to GDP numbers. And by the way, it's not your fault, to be clear, because the news outlets are all pushing it your way right now. And here's 2 reasons why. The first is this. When is the last time you actually cared about GDP? I mean, we all care about it. We talk about it. But seriously, you're now talking about it at the dinner table. Media outlets right now are pushing these acronyms and pushing the vernacular of inflation and supply chain, all of which we've talked about here on the Make Your Money Matter show. And all of these words, they're seeping into our conversations. I think we can all be honest about that, right? Because we're hearing it every day. Not to say it's not important, but nerds like me have to study this stuff. That's our job. GDP, supply chain, inflation, that's all the stuff you offload to a fiduciary advisor. So the fact that it's in our everyday vernacular now is quite interesting, I think. Where did that come from? And the second reason I want to bring up today is what I've been sharing with clients. And I shared this recently actually with a review client I was doing. And I want to share with you, and this is important. If they come out here and officially, if everyone just agreed that we are all in a recession, and then we all just agreed, which technically, again, by the rule of thumb, we are, does it matter? And here's what I mean by that. Does it change the way you actually think about what's already happened this year? Did it change the fact that months ago you started paying more for gas? Did it change the fact that milk and eggs and basically everything we're buying nowadays at the grocery store has gone up? No. So in a weird way, and I'm going to just openly say this, I'm almost like, you know what? Let's just say we're in a recession. Let's all just label it. We'll just get over this whole, is it or is it not? Yes, we are. No, we're not. It doesn't really matter. The reality, the rule of thumb, again, if you go on that, is 2 consecutive negative GDP down quarters is technically a recession. Now, fundamentally speaking, getting back to my thesis for today, from an economic perspective, the US is not in a recession, and here's why. And at least not yet, I should say. Now, I know how bold of a statement that may be right now to many of you watching who are just saying, how can they not be a recession? Because it's somewhat now a politicized statement, right or wrong. But I'm talking about a very different point of view, again, when it comes to economics. And I want to share why GDP by itself is in general one indicator, but it's not the only indicator. So let me share some numbers with you that I think are important to build today's show around the context here. There are building conversations we have to talk about, government conversations to talk about, trade, inventories, consumption, business investment. All of those things go into looking at a true recession. Now, check this out for a second. Industrial production rose at about 4.8% annual rate in the first quarter of this year, and then a 6.2% rate in the second quarter. Unemployment, another factor we look at, is lower now than at the end of 2021. Payrolls, which shows our wages of increases, payrolls grew at a monthly rate of 539,000 in the first quarter, and then another 375,000 in the second quarter. So I ask this, if we're already in a recession, none of this other aspects other than GDP would really be happening, would it? Now, that's why I want to come out and say this. The National Bureau of Economic Research, which, by the way, fun fact here, that is the NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research, is the quote unquote official arbiter of recessions. And they use, again, a wide range of data when assessing whether the economy is or is not in a recession or the economy is shrinking. So I want to reemphasize these notes here because I want to talk about some of the things that are not being talked about that have a lot to do with what some of our leaders right now, I might say, left or right, doesn't matter, are saying. Because if someone were to say we're truly in a recession, again, would it change how you've already viewed the first 7 or 8 months of this year? I would argue no. I know I'm paying more at the gas. I know I'm paying more at the grocery store. I know I'm seeing volatility in the stock market. And I also know the consumer sentiment around us is negative. So generally, all around us, as we talked about, everything is more. I mean, just recently I had to do a small project on my house, and normally my father-in-law would just get out there and pour some quick Crete and just do some quick stuff, right? Well, I decided to outsource it because the job got a little bit bigger. And a couple of years ago, I did something similar, and I was quoted for like $10 a square foot when it came to concrete, like all in. Now it's like $16 or $17. I mean, that's one example. Many of you watching right now or listening have those same examples right now. So we're seeing it across the board. We know things have generally gone up. That's the part of inflation we've been talking about a lot, and the general rise and this recession of a shrinking environment and seeing the volatility in the market. So the fact that someone says we're in a recession doesn't really change our sentiment, if you really are honest with yourself, or our thought process as to what's happened overall this year. But I want to talk about some other environments here. And a couple I mentioned earlier is one is consumption. Real, and by real, we mean inflation adjusted sales outside the auto sector. We're just going to remove that for a second. Real consumption grew at a 2.2% annual rate. And it looks like, by the way, real services spending should be continuing at a pretty solid pace. Cars and light truck sales, that one category, that did fall by about 20%. Putting it all together, we're actually estimating that we've seen this from some economic research that we follow through First Trust. There's a guy named Brian Westbury. There's some guys like that we look at for some economic data. Not across the board. We look at a lot of varying opinions on consumer spending, on real consumer spending, again, inflation adjusted, that on goods and services combined basically increased by a relatively modest 1.2%, which we're going to keep some tallying here, okay? That adds about 0.8 points to the real GDP growth rate, which is 1.2 times the consumption share of GDP, which is right around 68% for anyone doing math. So it equals about 0.8. Now, the second piece we're going to bring up, and we'll do a tally here at the end, is business investment. We don't talk about this a whole lot, but I want you to hear it from us. Now, stay with me here. There's an estimate out there at about 5.5% annual growth rate for business equipment investment, a 7.5% gain in intellectual property. We know that is IP. There was also a 4% decline in commercial construction. So all of that combined, business investments look so far like it grew at a little over 4% rate, which if you put that into GDP would add about 0.6 points to real inflation adjusted GDP growth. Now, home building. Residential construction looks like it actually contracted. We've seen that with some interest rates, which we're seeing now. I think a lot of us can feel that when the actual numbers, of contraction were right around 4% of annual mortgage rates. So as we all saw, they should eventually become more of a headwind, these higher interest rates. But it looks like an increase in spending on construction was more than accounted for by inflation and construction costs. So a decline in a 4% rate would subtract about 0.2 points from real GDP growth. By the way, we're going to keep a scoreboard here. So again, stay with us. And I want to talk about government now for a second. Remember, only direct government purchases of goods and services, not transfer payments, and transfer payments are things like unemployment insurance and things like that, count when someone is calculating GDP. So again, there's some estimates out there showing that these purchases, which represent about 17% share of the GDP number, they were basically unchanged, which means there's effectively a zero effect on real GDP. Now, there's last two categories I want to bring up here, and we'll tally it up here for a second, are trade and inventories. So we talk about trade, it's imports and exports. Exports have surged while imports spiked in the first quarter. The first quarter basically has remained basically flat, which means there's a smaller trade deficit if you look at the numbers. Now, at present, a lot of people are projecting, and we're seeing some numbers out there of net exports will add another 1 point to real GDP growth. So then we get into inventories. They actually grew at a slower pace in the second quarter than first quarter, which is a good thing, depending on what you're looking at. It's basically suggesting a drag of about 1.7 points on the real growth rate of GDP. However, just like trade, there's a report coming out here soon that'll forecast that a little bit differently coming up. But we'll talk about that later. But if you add all this up, this again, from economic research bases, we get a 0.5% annual real GDP growth for the second quarter, not a loss. So real quick, pause in the show for a second. What I'm getting at here is the concept of what we're hearing from our administration and what we're hearing from other pundits saying that how can we not be in a recession? By the way, for us to just go out and label something just to label it is kind of just to give us peace of mind. Like just calling something red and saying that's red doesn't mean that it changed the fact that you already knew it was red. Okay, bad example. But the point is this, back to my original question in the onset of the show is, if someone were to tell you right now, hey, we're in a recession, be like, okay, like I've known that. I mean, you don't really know that because you've seen volatility and inflation, but like, okay, doesn't shock me, But when you talk about recession and you do this like labeling of rule of thumb around, 2 consecutive GDP quarters, that's not it. There's other things to consider, which is why I wanted to add this up for every one of our followers, our listeners out there, our clients watching. This is what we look at unobjectively, unbiasedly, making sure that we're able to design for you the right portfolio and the right retirement, putting all this thing into context. Nothing really changes by this statement of saying we may not be in a recession right now, doesn't mean we're not going to be in one later, because when you look at other factors other than GDP, because again, context matters. Back to my original point, GDP is one indicator, not the only indicator of a recession in terms of where we are at the growth in our economy. You add GDP with consumption, business investment, home building, with overall government spending, which leads into trade and inventories. That's how you look at an overall recession. And with the numbers I just went up to, I know it was kind of a lot of math there, but when you add it up and you go through all the other categories, we actually show a real inflation-adjusted GDP. And by we, I mean a lot of economists out there looking at fundamental numbers are looking at more of a second quarter, almost half point of growth. So when you go through all that stuff, you start thinking again, monetary policy, by the way, bringing that back up, will eventually tighten. And we think that eventual tightening will cause us to be in a true recession because it will really cool the economy down. But to us, it really hasn't started just yet. And again, a quote unquote negative GDP number. Now you might all be thinking, okay, all right. So if you think there is a recession or it's imminent or it's on the horizon, what do you do? That's probably the next step. That's what we talk about with our clients. And I've talked to a lot of clients about this recently. Here's some stats. And I brought this up on a show, I think last week or week before. We've gone through in the past 40 years, we've gone through 6 different recessions. The last one you probably truly remember was 2008. We went through one in 2020 though, during COVID. It was quick, but the last one was in 2020. We've also gone through 5 bear markets recently, in 2020 being the last one, 2008, 2001. So we've gone through a lot in a relatively short period of time. And I know my answer today might be a blanketed response to some of these questions. That's where we do more one-on-one, and I might get some eye rolls here, but here's what I want to come back to always and forever. My 2 Ds, discipline and discernment. Stay disciplined to your dollar cost averaging through your contributions at work. If you're still working, or if you're saving and not working, you can still continuously invest to your investments or your 401ks. In fact, right now, if you have cash flow, that's a great time to almost increase that. It's one of those conversations right now when you see things right now, mid-year 2020, that were basically 15 to 20% cheaper than where they were at the end of last year, 7 months ago. What's the one thing we know about investing? Buy low, sell high. And if you think fundamentally speaking, as we do, it's not going to happen tomorrow necessarily, but if we see general good going on in the underbelly of what's happening here in our economy, both domestically and internationally, then it's a great time to invest. Again, that's not for everybody at all times. That's when you want to sit with your advisor, put your plan in context. If you don't have one, by the way, reach out to us. But generally speaking, when you have prices like we are seeing right now here in August, really where we're at right now from where it was basically 8 months ago or so, stocks in general, the market in general, are about 20% cheaper, as I mentioned. Is everything cheaper? No. Are there certain sectors or industries you want to focus on? Probably. And that's what we do for our clients here at One Capital. But dollar cost averaging, staying disciplined to your approach, and having discernment, just because something went down doesn't mean it's the greatest investment. Just because something says, blankly like, hey, everything's just cheaper, so buy across the board, you gotta still be pragmatic and logical when it comes to what you're buying as well. And that's where we come in. That's where advisors come in. That's where fiduciary advisors come in terms of active management and rebalancing. That's what you want from an advisor. So for those of you out there, the reality is that having counsel, having that advocate to help you navigate those waters matters. I mean, there's probably no better of a time than a year like this to really take stock in what you are doing with your investments and your planning. And as you've heard me say, I'm sure if you've watched the show or listened here, you don't want to get emotional when it comes to investing. The times that we get emotional are the times when things are volatile, like this year. It's easy for someone to make money in the year like a 2019 or a 2020 even, believe it or not. I mean, we had a couple weeks, maybe a month or two, that were down there in 2020 during the pandemic, but you saw the V-shaped recovery. So we get very myopic and honed in on what's going on just right in front of you, and we almost lose the peripheral view. That's what happens during volatility. It's basically like looking through your windshield while driving out of a dime-sized viewpoint versus using the whole windshield. And sometimes that helps having a co-pilot in that car with you to help you see everything that's going on. So either you're looking out of a dime-sized vision piece on your windshield, or sometimes even worse, you're navigating going forward by simply looking in your rearview mirror. Neither one are very efficient or effective to making sure that you do the right thing and being a good steward with the money you've been blessed with from your income and ultimately from your savings and investing. Because at the end of the day, what you do with your investments you have right now matters. You need to look at it with context. And for many, when you retire, that's not a finish line. I mean, God willing, the same amount of time you had working, whether that's working for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, you'll have the same time in retirement. So you have to look at your portfolio and all the stuff that's going on around you through a longer time horizon. Now, putting that into context with your plan, making sure it fits for what you and your family want to do matters most. And I hope today, talking about some of the numbers about GDP hasn't left you confused. I know I went through a lot of numbers there. And I know a lot has been politicized, and I don't want really like that factor because economically speaking, there's other indicators when it comes to defining our recession. But ultimately, again, if we are in a recession, and if we generally accept that, does it really change your idea about what's gone on this year? Does your life change right now from where it was yesterday? Because you've been paying these high prices and seeing this volatility in the market for over 7 months now. So the fact that someone comes and just labels it doesn't really change anything. And I think that's an interesting point about where you're at to pray on and to understand for yourself. Talk about it with your advisor and make sure you are pragmatic and disciplined going forward, making sure it works for your overall objectives heading into whatever stage of your life you're going into, whether it's retirement or a new job or just getting your finances and your investing in order. Okay, it's time to answer your questions. If you have a topic or question you'd like me to address here on the show, you can leave a comment or question in the comment section. Or if it's something a bit more personal, you want to talk one-on-one, just go to the About page on the channel, send us an email. We'll always keep the questions I read here anonymous, so you never have to worry about your name being shared, but we'd love to hear from you. So the question that came in this week actually came from a client and a friend that I wanted to share on the show. Brad, we're in a recession. You can't redefine the word recession. And obviously that came from a lot of things that are going on right now, which we see. And I want to be very clear about what I'm saying in the show. I'm not saying that we should or should not be redefining or redesigning a word that's been used What I'm saying is the collective thought process around the rule of thumb that says, okay, if this hits, then we're definitely in a recession. 2 negative GDP quarters, and I told this to my friend, 2 negative GDP quarters is a show of our economy, US-wise, slowing, or negative, meaning contracting. What I mentioned today on the show, which I think is really important, and I'm going to send this to him and say, watch this, I wrote this episode for you, is around other areas that we look at when it comes to the growth or the contraction of our economy. As I mentioned, business investment matters, trade matters, inventory and overall government spending, plus or minus, matters. So when you add all those things up, there's going to be areas that have grown and there's going to be areas that haven't grown. So you want to net it out. And that's how we got to that rough number of about 0.5%. By the way, I mean some economists that I follow when I was doing some research for today's show, one of them being Brian Westbury of First Trust and some other areas. We also use some sources here today from S&P 500, from Bloomberg, a lot of stuff I pulled from that. And again, the NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research, which again is the official arbiter, if you will, of are we or are we not in a recession, which to me is where I feel like our administration is getting their data. I know it's being politicized, is what I meant earlier around, oh my gosh, they're trying to redefine what a recession is. And that's why I think, look, collectively, I think we all can agree that we've seen a pretty volatile year and a contracting year. But that doesn't mean there's other areas of our economy, is what I'm trying to share, that have grown. That's why I shared some of those today, right? Consumer spending, wages, payrolls. I mean, those are areas that collectively bring into the overall economy, and that's why I wanted to go through it. So I'm not saying, that someone labeling or not labeling a recession, is a good or bad thing. What I am saying is that I think, going back to my original question, was if we all just woke up today and just agreed, every single person just vehemently agreed that we're in a recession, I don't think anyone would be like, oh yeah, that's shocking. Because we've all been like, we've seen the volatility. We've seen what's going on in the markets. We've seen basically everything around us go up in price, which is inflation. We've seen supply chain issues where we can't find truckers or dock workers or things to offload supply. So it's been around us the whole time. So my point in saying this really is this. It's like it is or it is not. Like it's one of those things where let's just all collectively say we are, let's just move on. Because the reality is markets are still the holdings that you own in your investments don't care whether or not some person or some figurehead says we're in a recession or not. Does it? No CEO of any company that you're invested in really understands whether or not they label it or not. They're looking pragmatically at their numbers, at their workforce, at their stores, whatever it is, and designing what they need to do for next quarter, not looking backwards. So I guess the point I'm trying to say, and to answer my friend and our client that we were going through, and I want to share with you today about that question is, Brad, we're in a recession. Let's all agree. I said, fine, let's all agree. But I'm just saying there's other areas to look at. Okay. And I think they're important for you to know. And I think it's really important to look up the NBER and look up some other areas now that the vernacular is in our everyday of GDP. In a weird way, I think it's good that we all now are hearing these terms more frequently than we have before. I mean, I was talking to someone the other day and they had to have to clarify what GDP was. By the way, that's not an abnormal thing. Okay. Not everyone understands what the acronym of GDP is in its, understanding. So that, amongst other things, I think when you put one thing out there, you should also kind of make sure you put other things out there too, that you know what to look at. And again, there's other things out there: consumer spending, retail sales, wages and payrolls, trade, inventories. I mean, those are all other areas of our economy that most CEOs look at, most economists look at, and what us as good financial advisors and portfolio managers need to also look at. So again, if you have a question or comment you'd like me to read here, leave it in the comments section, or again, you can email us in the About page on our channel. But before we go, if you found anything helpful today and want to learn more, you can visit us on our website at onecapital.com. You can also scan the QR code that's on your screen with your smartphone, and that'll get you right there. You can also call or text us. Look, we want to help. Listen, there's no pressure here. We don't treat people like a number. In fact, we value relationships. It's the lifeblood of what we do. So click, call, or text us today. By the way, if you're not following us on social media, you should be. You can follow us at Make Your Money Matter. We're sharing great information on all of our social media platforms. As I often say, if you enjoy the show, share it with someone you like. And if you don't like it, I guess share it with someone you don't like. But until next time, always remember, make your money matter.